On September 1st, 2026, Sweden quietly flips a switch that most of Europe hasn't noticed yet. Until now, a foreign national convicted in a Swedish court usually stayed. Judges weighed the crime, weighed his years in Sweden, and let him remain. From September, any crime punished more harshly than a fine becomes grounds for removal. Prosecutors are ordered to demand it, and the courts lose the one excuse they leaned on for decades. Sweden's own investigators estimate deportation sentences will jump from about 500 a year to 3,000, 6 times more, and it's only one of 4 laws. To understand what happens in September, you first have to understand what Sweden used to be. For most of the past 40 years, Sweden was the country in Europe that said yes. Yes to Chileans fleeing a dictatorship. Yes to Bosnians in the 90s, to Somalis, to Iraqis after 2 wars. And then in 2015, when Europe faced the largest movement of people since the Second World War, Sweden said yes, on a scale that nobody had prepared for. 162,000 people applied for asylum in a single year in a country of 10 million. That was the highest number per person of any country in the European Union, and more than 35,000 of them were children who arrived alone. On the 6th of September that year, Prime Minister Stefan Löfven stood in the rain at Medborgarplatsen in Stockholm, in front of thousands of people holding signs that read, "Refugees welcome." And he said the sentence that would follow Swedish politics for the next decade. My Europe does not build walls. 11 weeks later, on the 24th of November, the very same government called a press conference where a minister broke down crying on camera and announced that Sweden was closing the door. Order checks. Identity controls on the bridge from Denmark. Temporary permits instead of permanent ones. The country that had told the continent it would never build walls had just built one, and it had taken less than 3 months. That whiplash is the origin of everything that followed. Because a country can reverse a policy in 11 weeks, it cannot reverse a decade in 11 weeks. By the end of 2025, according to Statistics Sweden, roughly 2.2 million people living in Sweden had been born abroad. That's about 20% of the population. Count the Swedish-born children of foreign-born parents, and the share of the population with a foreign background reaches 35.7%. In a country that a generation earlier had been one of the most homogeneous in Europe, that was not a statistical adjustment. That was a different country. And in parts of that country, something went badly wrong. Sweden developed a problem that Swedes found impossible to talk about for years, and then impossible to talk about anything else. Gang violence. Not ordinary crime, organized, territorial, and increasingly indifferent to who was standing nearby. In January of 2025 alone, Swedish police recorded more than 30 bombings across the country. That is roughly 1 explosion every day for a month, in Sweden, in neighborhoods both poor and wealthy, mostly tied to gang feuds and extortion. Swedish police have said that in the space of 3 years, more than 20 complete bystanders were killed in gangland shootings. People who had no connection to anything, people walking home. This is the part outsiders underestimate. The Swedish social contract was never mainly about money. It was about trust. A country does not run some of the highest taxes on earth unless the people paying in believe the person next to them plays by the same rules. Bombs on residential streets do not just kill people, they dissolve the assumption the whole system is built on. And when that assumption cracks, politics moves fast. In September of 2022, Swedish voters ended 8 years of social democratic government. Ulf Kristersson became Prime Minister at the head of a minority coalition of moderates, Christian Democrats, and liberals, kept in power by the Sweden Democrats, a party that had spent its entire existence being described as untouchable by the Swedish establishment. The four parties signed a cooperation document at Tidö Castle, and the Tidö Agreement did not hide what it wanted. It called, in writing, for a paradigm shift.
A move away from a rights-based migration system toward a restrictive one, bringing Sweden down to the absolute minimum that European Union law would allow. And then, unlike most political documents, it actually happened. Sweden's migration minister, Johan Forssell, says that since this government took office, asylum applications have fallen by about 60%, while returns to countries of origin have risen by roughly the same margin. The raw numbers back the direction. In 2025, Sweden received 6,737 asylum applications. That was a 30% drop from the year before. The Swedish Migration Agency's own forecast for 2026 is 5,500, which would put Sweden at its lowest level of asylum seekers since 1997. And then there is the number that genuinely has no modern precedent.
For the first time in more than 50 years, more people are leaving Sweden than arriving. Net emigration. In the country that defined European openness, the arrow has reversed. Sweden also started paying people to go. On the 1st of January 2026, the voluntary repatriation grant was raised to 350,000 krona per adult, around 30,000 euros, plus 25,000 krona per child. In 2025, under the old and much smaller grant, 109 people applied and exactly one was approved. The Migration Agency now expects around 600 people a year to take the money. So here is where Sweden stood at the start of 2026. Asylum numbers collapsing, returns rising, population flow reversed for the first time since the 1970s. Cash on the table for anyone who wanted to leave. And that was before any of the new laws had taken effect. Because 2026 is not the year Sweden tightened one rule. It is the year Sweden rewrote 4 separate parts of the machine, and each one removes a different obstacle that used to stand between a foreign national and the exit. Start with the one arriving in September, because it is the sharpest. On the 25th of February 2026, the Swedish government presented its proposal for stricter deportation on grounds of crime. In April, it confirmed it was moving ahead. The new rules take effect on the 1st of September. Today, deportation after a conviction is a balancing act. A Swedish court weighs the seriousness of the offence against the person's ties to Sweden. How long have they lived here? Do they have children here? Do they speak the language? In practice, that balance almost always tipped towards staying. 4 things change at once. First, the threshold drops to the floor. Any offence punishable by something more severe than a fine now counts as grounds for deportation. Not violent crimes specifically, not organised crime specifically. The category is defined by the penalty, and it is a very low bar. Second, prosecutors lose their discretion. Where an offence qualifies, the prosecutor is now required to demand deportation. Not permitted to, required to. That single sentence changes the volume of cases more than any other line in the law, because it removes the person who used to decide a case was not worth it. Third, and this is the one Swedish lawyers argue about most, courts will no longer take impediments to enforcement into account. Until now,
If a person could not actually be sent anywhere because their home country was at war or no state would accept them, the court factored that in and often did not order removal at all. From September, the court rules, and whether it can ever be carried out becomes somebody else's problem later. Fourth, the protection for people who came as children is gone. Sweden previously applied a much higher standard before deporting someone who had arrived before the age of 15. That qualified requirement has been removed.
Someone who arrived in Sweden at 7, went to Swedish schools, speaks Swedish as a first language, and has never lived anywhere else, no longer has a special shield. Re-entry bans get longer too, and in many cases become unlimited. Not 5 years, not 10, permanent. The government's own impact assessment estimates that the number of people sentenced to deportation for crimes will rise from roughly 500 a year to about 3,000. A six-fold increase written into the official documents by the people who wrote the law. Forsell's framing, translated from the Swedish press release, is that Sweden now gets the toughest deportation rules in Scandinavia, and that those who commit crimes have forfeited Swedish hospitality and must leave. Ludvig Aspling of the Sweden Democrats called it the end of tolerance for dangerous criminals. Now, that law is about people convicted of something.
The second law is not. On the 13th of July, 2026, Sweden introduced a requirement that the Swedish system calls vandel. In English, it has been translated as honest living or good conduct, and it does something Swedish migration law has never done at this scale. It allows a residence permit to be refused or revoked based on an assessment of how you live, without a criminal conviction anywhere in the process. The government announced it on the 24th of March. The grounds listed include refusing to settle outstanding debts, failing to comply with decisions from public authorities, defrauding the welfare system, tax offences, links to extremist organisations, and being found to have lied on your original application. Read that list again, because the first two items are not crimes. Unpaid debt is not a crime in Sweden. Ignoring an administrative decision is not a crime in Sweden. Both are now grounds on which a lawful resident can lose the right to be here. Human rights organizations argue the standard is vague and subjective, that it makes people unequal before the law, and that a rule about respectable living can quietly become a rule about acceptable opinions. The government's position is that a residence permit is a privilege granted on conditions. The third law is the one that produced protests in Stockholm. On the 15th of June 2026, the Swedish Parliament passed what critics named the snitch law. It obliges 6 government agencies, including the Public Employment Service, the Tax Agency, the Social Insurance Agency, and the Pensions Agency, to report undocumented migrants to the police. The vote was 174 to 172, 2 votes. The original proposal was broader.
It would have covered teachers, doctors, and social workers, which meant a child in a classroom or a patient in an emergency room could trigger a police report. After sustained public criticism, those professions were carved out. The law passed anyway, and it takes effect on the same day as the honest living rule, the 13th of July. Opponents argue the practical effect reaches far beyond the 6 agencies because deterrence does not read legislation.
If people believe the state is looking for them, they avoid the state entirely, including the parts that were exempted. And then the fourth piece, the one that gets no international coverage, but may be the most revealing. From the 1st of June 2026, people who have been ordered deported but cannot actually be removed, the exact group the September law stops the courts from considering, face restricted freedom of movement, restricted access to work, and reduced access to the welfare system. Put those two laws side by side. One says the court must order you out even when nobody can send you out. The other says that while you remain here, unremovable, your daily life gets narrower. The same year brought more. From the 1st of June, work permits require a salary of 90% of the Swedish median, about 33,000 krona a month. From the 6th of June, citizenship requires 8 years of residence instead of 5, plus language and civics tests. From the 12th of July, permanent residence permits in asylum cases are effectively finished. From the 1st of October, a new reception law assigns asylum seekers to designated areas, and leaving them costs you your support. There are two more proposals that have not passed. One would make already granted permanent permits revocable and convert them into temporary ones. The other, dated 2028, would allow Swedish citizenship to be revoked for fraud or serious crime. Neither is law. Both are on the table. If you want to understand why this is happening now, stay with the numbers, because they do not say what you would expect. Swedish violence is falling. The National Council for Crime Prevention reported 84 homicides in 2025, down from 92 the year before, the lowest level in over a decade. In the first half of 2026, Sweden recorded 39 shootings with 8 deaths. In the same period a year earlier, it was 86 shootings and 27 deaths. Shootings were roughly halved. Deaths fell by 2/3. Asylum applications are heading for a 29-year low. Net migration has reversed. Returns are up. So Sweden is passing the harshest migration laws in its modern history at the precise moment when almost every indicator the laws are supposed to fix is already improving. There is a straightforward explanation, and it is on the calendar. Sweden votes in September 2026. The deportation law takes effect on the 1st of September. The election is that same month.
A government that spent 4 years promising a paradigm shift needs the shift to be visible, not pending, when voters walk into the booth. There is also a less cynical explanation, and both can be true. Falling numbers do not restore broken trust. A country that spent a decade watching bombs go off does not feel safe because statistics improved for 18 months. Politics runs on memory. Either way, the effect on the rest of Europe is the same, because Sweden is not doing this alone anymore. On the 1st of June 2026, the European Union agreed on the return regulation, described across European media as the strictest migration law the bloc has ever adopted. It allows member states to send rejected asylum seekers to return hubs in third countries. It raises the maximum detention period from 6 months to 2 years, with a possible further 6 months and unlimited detention for those deemed security risks. It removes the requirement to prove any connection to the country they are sent to. It introduces mutual recognition of deportation orders across borders. It extends entry bans from 5 years to 10, with lifetime bans available. It ends the automatic suspension of deportation during an appeal, and it lets authorities search the homes of irregular migrants. The reason it passed is one statistic. Across the European Union, only 29% of people ordered to leave actually leave. 7 out of 10 stay. Every European government knows it, and no European government has been able to fix it with the existing tools. Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, and Greece have already formed a group to build deportation centers outside Europe, negotiating with countries mostly in Africa, following the model Italy built in Albania.
Denmark is preparing legislation to expel more foreign nationals while openly accepting that it may collide with the European Court of Human Rights. Not everyone is applauding. Melissa Camara, a Green member of the European Parliament, called the final text the result of a shameful agreement. But here is why Sweden specifically matters more than the size of its population suggests. Denmark going hard on migration surprised nobody. Sweden is different. Sweden was the moral argument, the country other governments were measured against when they were accused of being cruel. For a generation of European politics, "My Europe does not build walls" was the standard. And Sweden said it out loud in the rain in front of a cheering crowd. That country now has the toughest deportation rules in Scandinavia, obliges its tax authority to report undocumented residents to the police, can strip a residence permit over unpaid debt, and pays €30,000 to anyone willing to leave for good. When the country that set the standard abandons it, the standard is gone. There is no longer a European government that can be told, "Look at Sweden, this is what decency looks like." That argument does not exist anymore, and every interior ministry on the continent understands exactly what that means for what they can now propose without being called extreme. So the real question is not whether Sweden's new laws will remove more people. They will.
The mechanics are built for volume, and the government has published the number it expects. The question is what a country becomes when the exit is this wide. When the man deported for a crime and the woman who lost her permit over a debt are processed by the same machinery. When a person who arrived at 7 years old is treated in law the same as someone who arrived last year. When the difference between belonging and not belonging is a paperwork decision that can be reopened at any time. Sweden spent the last decade discovering that openness without limits has a cost. It is now finding out what limits without a flaw cost instead. So tell us in the comments, did Sweden finally do what the rest of Europe was too afraid to do? Or did it just quietly dismantle the one model the continent had left? And subscribe to Global Perspective, because the laws we just walked through take effect over the next few weeks, and the rest of Europe has already started copying the paperwork.